Hello guys, good morning. I hope everybody's doing good. Man, the technical difficulties never cease. I had a catastrophic failure about 10 minutes ago. Everything on my computer froze, shut down. I had to turn it off, reboot it. I guess that's just how it goes. Technology, what can you say? Good morning, guys, by the way. Good morning, Michael. Come alive. Good to have you back, sir. Northbound Believer. Mama Chose Joy, good morning. C. Jones, Rick Bowser, I appreciate you all. Mama Chose Joy, no, topics are never full. You can always add a topic, and whether we can get to it or not, I'll have to decide. But we have a few on the board just from last week, and as I said, I just had a technical catastrophic failure. So I'm hoping that I didn't lose a bunch of the work I did this morning getting ready, but regardless, I know where to get it all again, so it's not a problem anyway. But let me get my the topics that we do have up on the screen for you. All right. Good morning, Katie Turner and Mom. I hope y'all are doing great. Perusia, good morning. Thank you for joining, guys. Oh, let's see here. Please, please. Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. It did recover the document of my work from this morning, so let me get the topics on the screen for you guys. Sorry about the craziness. All right. So far, we have these. By the way, good morning, Jeriel. It's good to have you. These three topics, let's see. I think I need to move myself over a little bit. There we go. How often did the Apostolic Church practice communion, and how does this relate to Quartodecimanism? And this was from Cornelius last week. I do have a good bit of information on this one. The validity of Paul's letters. C. Jones, you particularly mentioned this, and then Russell Davis chimed in and said, yeah, that's interesting to me too. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then I don't remember who brought it up. It might have been Cornelius. I'm not sure. But King Melchizedek, I think, is a very interesting topic. So I can present a little bit of information on that today if we want to do that. That might be one we bump if you guys come up with other things. And so Mama Chose Joy, I see you say there, your topic is the Great Commission. Great Commission, was it fulfilled in Romans 1? All right. Yeah, we'll talk about that. That's a good one. Come Alive, you published a video about preterism yesterday. Excellent, sir. I'll have to check it out. I will have to check that out. And I would encourage anyone on the call to support Come Alive by checking out his video as well when you have time this week. That'd be great. Jeriel, you say, is God calling us to be rich financially? Okay, yeah. That's a good topic. It's one that, Jeriel, as I think about that, I really it makes me, and just hearing you say it, it makes me want to go back through the scriptures and specifically look at what God did say about finances or promises to perhaps Israel about that kind of thing and what that really means. And there's really a lot to that discussion. Really, really a lot. Yeah. Stacia, good morning. And Jeannie, good morning. Jason Sumner, thank you for joining. I'm in front of my notes here, but you guys can see. So we have a good number of topics already now. But again, like I told Mama Chose Joy a minute ago, just continue to mention topics. We use this first 10 minutes or so to get topics. And that helps me also. If we have more than we can do, it helps me know what to study for next week. So Northbound Believer, you say, I would love further discussion on the different Bible versions and which you prefer and why. I like that. Thank you, Northbound Believer. Definitely a good discussion always. It's one we've had a little bit before, but there's really a lot to be said there. A lot to be said. It's a good topic. It helps people, I think, reset on generally how they study the Bible. What needs to be done to actually study the Bible. Come Alive, you say you read the MEV and the KJV? Yeah. I mean, that topic could be bumped to the front, really, because I think it won't take too long. And I love doing those kinds of things that are things we all need to be reminded of. And especially if we have new people that, I just think it's good to level set on what we should expect when we come to the scriptures. So that to me is very important. I'm just looking back up through some of the topics, make sure I'm not missing anything y'all are mentioning. Okay. Yeah, we're getting a little close to the 10-minute mark. So if you have another topic, get it in and then we'll get started. Mama Chose Joy, I can't believe you're hogging all the topics. You say Joshua 10 and the sun standing still. I've heard this explained different from how I read it. Okay. Joshua 10, the sun stood still. And that is Mama Chose Joy. Yeah, Mama Chose Joy. I may... I like this topic, but I think to fully answer or give you a viewpoint on it, I would maybe want to study it further for the purpose of answering your question. Do you know what I'm saying? There's actually a lot to unpack there, a lot of things that, viewpoints that come out of that passage. So I might want to take a little time to, this week possibly to decide how I want to address it and what information to bring to the surface, Come Alive, you're moving into a topic. Before we get into the topic, why don't we start the topics? Why don't we get started? Let's see. So that, to me, I do kind of want to move this Bible version topic to the front from Northbound. Thank you for that. Mama Chose Joy, I'm going to leave Joshua 10 at the bottom for now. And we'll see if we get to it. I'm thinking we won't, and that'll give me a chance to study more for that. Good morning, Judy Berry. I'm so glad to have you this morning. It's good to see you. Jeriel's, yours is kind of the same way. Again, I want to really address the finances. Is God calling us to be rich? I really want to give that a holistic treatment. So I may end up bumping that. The three here, the communion, the Paul's letters, and Melchizedek, I prepared some information, so we'll definitely do those today. And then Mama Chose Joy, we can probably get to your Great Commission question. So that we'll get that in by the end. And I think this is a good set for today. So that is it. Let's see. Next week. Yeah, I think that's going to happen. So, all right. Well, let's get into it then. Let's talk briefly about Northbound Believer, your topic of Bible versions. And, this is probably a repeat for some of us, but I don't think that's a problem at all. And I would encourage any of you, like Come Alive, you're doing there, put what Bible version you use or you gravitate towards. I would say put that in the chat, and that way I can see that and maybe discuss each of the versions that are being used. But I can tell you my approach. So this is what I almost always do, as I talk about my approach to the scriptures. So I generally start with the KJV or the New King James, and that's where I start because I grew up with it. I like the way it sounds. I like the thought, the feeling I get reading it in the Old English for some reason. And I'll admit that it's kind of a preference. It's a thing that I just like. Whether that matters or not, I don't know that it does. But for me, it gives it a sense of importance somehow. So I tend to prefer the King James almost exclusively now. I used to vacillate between. I used to use exclusively the New American Standard Bible, which Katie, you're saying you use NASB usually, and I used to do only the New American Standard, and the reason is because I had a Bible teacher in high school who he recommended that version specifically, and his explanation was that it was one of the most literal translations out at the time. And I found that actually during my study to be quite true. The New American Standard is very close to a literal translation when you compare it to the Greek in the New Testament specifically. So I do like the New American Standard a lot. And the way certain verses are worded is better than other translations. And it's not 100%, but it's good. Russell Davis, welcome this morning, brother. And you say Young's literal translation is considered best for literal, but it's hard to read. Yes, I like the Young's literal. A lot of times I will hit that one just to see if I get the better meaning of the verse without actually having to hit the Greek. Because Young's literal translation is so close to the Greek that it can solve a lot of problems if you use that translation. Sometimes that's a good second choice. But I guess in my later years here, close to the current time, I've become more interested in the Greek. And so I've taught myself a lot of Greek words, how to look up Greek. I can almost read Greek with, a lot of exceptions. So there's that. And that causes me to use the King James for reference so that I can get to verses that I know and I can see them. And then when I have a question about, am I truly understanding all about this verse, then I'll go to the Greek and I read through the Greek, use Strong's in a lot of cases to make sure I understand perfect meanings of those words. And then I do analysis that way. So to me, that is a good way. And really you could use that technique if you're willing to do that. And I have to say, for instance, BibleHub.com BibleHub.com, and I'll put that on the screen real quick, is just a great tool. This website is a great tool because, for instance, if I go to, the King James Version, Matthew chapter 1, or 16 rather, doesn't matter. But if you go to a chapter, and of course I like the King James, so I just hit the King James every single time, but then I want to see a verse in Greek, I can literally click on the verse number, and I use my middle mouse button that opens a new window. So now I have pulled the verse specific page, but then I click Greek over here, and it takes me straight to a word for word comparison between the Greek and the English. Now, in rare cases, I have found problems with their Greek in this view. So then I have other sources I go to get a little closer. But this gets you so close to the original manuscripts when you are looking word for word with the Greek. And what sometimes you'll find is, like, for instance, there's a word in the Greek that's not translated, and in this case, this word tau is just the. It means the. So they left out the word that we would translate in Greek to the in the King James here. Now, that's a very small change, a minor change. You might say, well, they were right because of the way it's worded. It makes more sense in English. Fine. Like Russell Davis was saying, the likelihood is that, like, the Young's literal translation keeps the word the here. It's because it's a very literal translation. But sometimes there are other words that are more important that are just left out in the English or changed. And so with this kind of view on Bible Hub, I can look at every single Greek word, many of which I'm starting to know now, and I don't even have to look up. But then over here on the left, you can get Strong's, and you can hit that and open it up in a new window. And so now I'm looking at what does Oranos, or heaven, mean, in the Greek. And of course, it's the visible heavens, the atmosphere, the sky, blah, blah, blah. And you get all these different helps. You get every verse in the Bible where that Greek word is used. And it's just super valuable when you're digging into a passage to do this kind of thing. There's no way you can do this in a normal English Bible. Just zero way. And so, and I will say this, there's really zero translations that get it all right. So I always push people towards, if you really want to get as close as you can in English, I think that you're probably going to need to look at the New American Standard, or like Russell Davis said, the Young's literal translation is good, but it's not super readable. It's those literal translations that because here's the mindset you have to have. No matter what the English says, there's a language behind it, right? And that's Greek in the New Testament. It's Hebrew in the Old Testament. By the way, the same tools at this website will work for Hebrew, okay? But you have to understand, no matter what the English says in any translation, that there's another language behind that doesn't mean the exact same thing. It just, period, will not mean the exact same thing as the English every time. There's no way it could. Even if we were translating Spanish into English, there's no way that you can translate every Spanish word into perfect English. It cannot happen. It cannot be done. The only thing you can do is you do a best approximation of some words. Some words just do not translate. So, Come Alive, you mentioned the Modern English version. I just don't know that version. So, I just don't know that version. So let's see. Does it have? How do I find out? I don't even know how to find out on Bible Hub if it has if it has that version. So let's see here. Bible. Let's see. Modern English. Modern English. I don't see the Modern English version here. So what's the Modern English version? There was a time when I was looking at this version, the Dr. Stephen Pidgeon's Et Sefer. Do you guys know of this version? Have you heard of this? Man, there was a time when I was like thinking that this was probably a great version, but the problem is that it's all Hebrew. It's all it's Hebrew, and it's not right. So I'm just gonna say, like, if you've seen this version mentioned, I think there's a lot of people on the kind of fringe apocalyptic right in, like Steve Quayle and Alberino and Thomas Horn. They talk about this guy, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, and his version, and I don't like this version. I'm just telling you, I don't think it's a good version. But it just came to mind, so I thought I'd mention that. Modern English version is interesting. And that's a pretty Bible. I like that. It is a translation of the Textus Receptus and the Jacob ben Hayim edition of the Masoretic, using the King James Version as the base manuscript. Well, okay. That sounds not bad. It might be good. I don't know, but I mean, I guess Come Alive, you vouch for it. You like it. It's good. Michael Spinale, you mentioned the Septuagint and Brenton's version or translation of the Septuagint. Definitely good. Definitely good to use the Septuagint. And I think Brenton's translation's a good one. I don't think there's a problem there. There, I think, are some online helps that let you examine the Greek of that Septuagint and go word by word. But yeah, that'd be good too. But, again, no translation's perfect, but I do like the Septuagint in general. Mama Chose Joy, you ask what the Septuagint is. So I probably should do a more exhaustive video on Septuagint only. The Septuagint is the version of the Bible that was being used at the time that Christ was walking the earth in the first century. It was in Greek because 250 years earlier, the Jews had translated their Hebrew texts of the Old Testament into Greek. The reason it's called the Septuagint is because, according to the writings we do have about that event where they translated it, there was about 70 or so elders of the Jews that got together and translated it into Greek in about 250 BC. And so it's called the Sept, meaning seven, the book of the book of the 70, the Septuagint. So that's what it is. And the early church fathers, a lot of them really praised the Septuagint for its accuracy. Also, we have some evidence that from those same church fathers that the Jews at the time after Christ came, and then after 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, all that the Jews had started going back to their Hebrew texts and changing some things and actually removing some things or changing words. So the Septuagint is a very accurate, in fact, it's quoted by the New Testament writers. When there's quotes from the Old Testament in the New Testament, they, in the Greek, match the Septuagint perfectly almost every single time. And then, as Michael Spinale is mentioning, the Septuagint being better than the Masoretic text is what most of our modern versions of the Bible are based on. The Masoretic is a Hebrew text that came about in 900 AD, almost 1,000 years after Christ. This group of Jews called the Masoretes got together and said, hey, we're going to publish the de facto standard of the Greek or the Hebrew scriptures. And so these Masorete Jews in 900 AD wrote down the Masoretic text of the Old Testament and told the world, this is the right thing. This is how it's supposed to be. And then most of our modern versions are based on that text instead of the Septuagint or any older Hebrew text. which the Septuagint is almost 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text. And even the King James is based on the Masoretic text. So I hope that explains. I'm trying to tell you everything quickly, but it's big. It's a lot of information, but that's what the Septuagint is. So I hope that helps. C. Jones, you asked, do you think the Catholic Church has anything to do with the rise of all the different translations after the KJV was pretty much it for 205 years? I don't know if I can answer that question, C. Jones. I don't know if I can answer that question. Russell Davis, you say once your church voted on which version to use as our official version, one lady got up and said we should use the King James Bible because that was the Bible Jesus used. It's that's kind of funny, isn't it? It's funny how people think things like that. It's not true. Yeah, I don't know why people say stuff like that. I just saw a strange anomaly in the comments, and I'm trying to figure out what just happened. Let me look at something really quick. By the way, I didn't get to say Squiffy Bear welcome, and I'm so happy you're on this morning. God bless you. I've been praying for you. All right, so I'm just checking my live stream on YouTube right now to make sure that everything is kosher. You know, I've seen some weird things happen, and I just saw something goofy happen, so. Okay. Northbound Believer, so if the King James Version is based off the Masoretic text, do you think it's not accurate? Genuinely curious. Yeah, that's a good question. So for one, there's no way you can say it's just not accurate on a holistic scale. That's a very general, broad statement. And so the reality is, no, it's not totally inaccurate. There are things in it that are wrong, but that's the case with every single translation that's English, okay? The Masoretic text, the main things that change are some of the prophecies about Christ. They have different words, they change in different places. For instance, there's a huge debate still in the Jewish Christian community about Isaiah, where it talks about the virgin birth. And the original word in the Septuagint and in the older Hebrew texts was the word for virgin in Hebrew, whereas the Masoretic text has the word for young maiden, which is somewhat the same but not the same. And so there's a lot of things like that you have to question, well, why would they change that? Well, of course it would be to obscure the fact that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, because they don't believe that. The Masoretes didn't believe Christ was Messiah, so of course that makes sense, right? The other thing that's really different in the Masoretic texts from the Septuagint is the genealogies in the first few books of the Bible. I guess in Genesis, the genealogies of the patriarchs and how many years they lived, they're very different from the Septuagint. And the Septuagint goes along with other ancient texts that talk about that there would be 5,500 years from Adam to Christ. And the Septuagint's genealogies match that perfectly, whereas the Masoretic genealogies added all together would have put Christ's coming at about 4,000 and something years from creation. And so the Septuagint, instead of saying that, it reinforces all of the oldest prophecies about Christ's coming. So again, if the Jews knew Christ was going to come in 5,500 years from Adam, then doesn't it make sense that if they didn't want anyone to think Christ was the Messiah, they would change their text to make that timeline totally incorrect? That he was not he didn't come at the time that the Messiah was promised from God, by God. And so the interesting thing about that is that if we do know those prophecies about the 5,500 years from Adam to Christ, and then you use the Septuagint timeline, then again, the time frame for Christ's coming has now already passed again. So, this is a tactic that I believe the Masoretes used to, again, obscure Christ's coming in the first century. And then, of course, they changed it at about 900 AD and made it look like the Messiah was about to come at that time. And then that time came and went. And now here we are. We have this Masoretic text that has these lies in it about the years, the time frames, and then the Septuagint that's right on the money because Christ was the Messiah. And so you see the issues there. Mama shows joy. But in general, the vast majority of the text of the Masoretic is not much different than the Septuagint or any of the older Hebrew manuscripts. So it's not going to ruin you in terms of understanding who God is, but it does change a few little things. So okay, trying to catch up now on you guys. You're moving quick on those chats. I see some mention of unclean animals. I don't know, Katie Turner, about that. I think we are permitted to eat unclean animals, yes. If you read the epistle of, the epistle of Barnabas, it talks about why the animals were considered unclean in the first place and why it doesn't matter anymore because that was part of the law. It was those unclean animals had characteristics that expressed what sin is. So they were considered unclean. And so the law, which was to point the Jews to sin, told them not to eat those animals because those animals did things that were considered sinful. They exhibited behaviors that seemed sinful. And so it was a picture given by God to the Jews of what sin is. Don't do it. So that's why in the New Testament, it's okay to eat meat from unclean animals because the law was completed and fulfilled. Not that that's much of a sidebar, but there you go. Squiffy Bear, do you think God has taken into account all of these inaccurate translations in terms of our salvation? Oh my goodness, that's a loaded question, Squiffy Bear. Such a loaded question. This is one of those where I have to defer to God and let him. I can't judge a person's heart, and I don't know. That's a tough question. Here's the real question you're asking. If God is God, how can he allow Satan to obscure the truth from us so badly that people cannot find the truth about who he is and who Christ is? That's your real question, right? It's a very foundational question, and I don't have an answer. I expressed to some of you this week that is something I want to ask God myself. How can you let it get to the point where people cannot find the truth? How can you let it get to a point where it's so obscured? Why does Satan have that kind of power? I don't understand. I don't understand that. I really don't. But I'm not God, and I'm sure maybe he'll be able to explain it to me when I get there. Maybe. I hope he can. Oh, goodness. Okay, let's see. C. Jones, serious question. You say, why would we use any translation that's based off the Masoretic? Well, one reason is because there's not many translations that aren't. If you want an English translation, it's tough. It's tough. It's tough if you want an English translation. Squiffy Bear, you say you asked God and received an answer. Would you mind sharing that answer, or is it something you'd like to keep to yourself? I don't mind either way. I just thought I'd ask. And Squiffy, that would be regarding, for the rest of us, that's regarding why God would allow things to be so obscured from people that we can't find the truth anymore. Jerry, you say maybe we can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth. That's right. Michael Spinell, you say get the Brenton Old Testament translation Bible. That's good. I like that. Mama Chose Joy, you say, I think that's where the Holy Spirit comes in. God knows how we hear and understand. He uses people to speak to us. Yeah, I agree. Squiffy Bear, you say, I don't think I could respond fully by text. I understand. I get it. It's a hard question that we all in this life have to wrestle with. I think if we're thinkers, if we're thinking and we're honest, we have to wrestle with that. Like, we don't, it's hard to understand why God would allow some things he allows, but that could be said about many things and many different time periods in history. Just realize we're not like unique in that as far as all of human history. The Jews would have asked the same thing when they were in Egypt. Why, God, do you allow us to stay in Egypt under the slavery of the Egyptians? You know, building their evil pagan obelisks and statues. So, Harvey Fry, good morning. Northbound, you say, I think this is where grace comes in. At some point, it's a matter of faith, trusting God to make up the difference where we fall short. Yeah, I think that's true. And, you know, honesty means you're honest about what you don't know. Some people aren't even honest about what they do not know. So if we're humble and honest that, you know, we don't know everything and we leave it in God's hands, that's the faith you're talking about. We're faithful. We're confident that in time he will explain what we need to know at the time we need to know it. So, all right, guys, I think we'll move to the second topic. Second topic. The second topic is pretty cool. It's from Cornelius, which I think I saw Cornelius. Yeah, you jumped in, so it's good to have you this morning. All right. Oh, let's see. I'm gonna have to change the title because it's too big. Okay, let's try this. What was the frequency of communion in the Apostolic Church? And what in turn is Quartodecimanism, and how does it relate to that, perhaps? So I've got quite a bit of information on this. I may not be able to answer every question, but I can at least point you at the things you're asking about. So the question about how often that the early church observed the communion, right? The Eucharist is what they called it. And so we see in, for instance, the Didache, which is early Christian writing, the statement that the Christians come together each Lord's Day of each day of the Lord to break bread and give thanks. Now, that to me doesn't necessarily sound like a communion exercise or a Eucharist, but some scholars point to this and say, well, that means that every Lord's Day, every Sunday, they would do the communion together, do the Eucharist. But I don't know that that's 100% true. I don't know that that's what that's saying. You know, I'm leaving room for that. That's not really a proof that they did the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Okay. So there is that statement, and a lot of scholars point to that and say, oh, that's it. Well, I'm not so sure. Then Justin Martyr, in his first apology, chapter 66 and 67, we'll read a little bit here. He says, and this food is called among us the Eucharist, of which no one is allowed to partake but the man who believes that the things we teach are true, and who has been washed with the washing that is for remission of sins, meaning baptism, and unto regeneration, and who is so living as Christ has enjoined. So, of course, a Christian who is a practicing Christian is allowed to participate in the Eucharist with Justin Martyr. And Justin Martyr, by the way, was, if I'm not mistaken, he lived and worked in Alexandria, northern Egypt. So there's a bit of a divide between some of the practices of the Egyptian church and the Palestinian churches. So just be aware of that as we go forward. But this last statement in that section says, "For not as common bread and common drink do we receive these." So this, I think, is an interesting and specific point. And I just realized I'm not showing you my windows. So let's make sure that's up there. So the Didache up here where I was saying, Christians, quote, come together each Lord's Day to break bread and give thanks. Some people say that's a proof for the communion. I'm not sure about that. But then, as I said, we're talking now about Justin Martyr and his first apology, chapter 66. But he has this statement that the Eucharist was not as common bread and common drink. So that to me says that the Eucharist was not a common thing. It may not specifically be talking about the frequency in which they did it, but this to me says it definitely wasn't every day, as some people suggest in scholarship. Some people suggest they did it every time they got together. I don't think that's true because of this statement like this. This not common. It's not like common bread and drink. This is special. It's something special. And then in his apology, chapter 67, we read this. And I'm going to see if I can make it a little bigger. Let's see here. I don't know. I want to make it bigger for you guys. Whoa, there, that's bigger. Okay. And on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities of the country gather in one place. The memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. This is like a Sunday service. This is what they did. And this is Justin Martyr in the early 2nd century. So I guess we could just pin it on 150 AD. At that time, they were doing this every Sunday. Reading the writings of the prophets as long as time permits, or the apostles. Then when the reader was done, the president of the church itself verbally instructs and exhorts the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray. And when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought. Now this is at least bread and wine. And the president in like manner offers prayer and thanksgiving according to his ability. And the people assent, saying amen. So they agree with what's happening. And then there's a distribution of the wine and water to each and a participation of that over which thanks has been given. So this, to me, says that on Sunday they did eat together. But as you know, bread and wine was kind of a staple of their society, right? Whereas we have all these goofy things and types of food from all over the world at our fingertips, they did not have that. And the Christians were not known for being very wealthy in general. So the fact that they ate bread and wine or water, as this statement says, when our prayer is ended, bread, wine, water are brought, that to me isn't a proof that this was the communion either, the Eucharist. It might be, but I can't say for sure. So I'm just showing you the information at this point. I'm not going to come down on, well, they definitely did it every Sunday, because I'm not sure of that, okay? So all this is very interesting, and really there's not a whole lot more. There's a lot more references to Eucharist, and I may be able to find more about when or how often they practiced. But to be honest, I didn't see a lot in terms of the frequency. They just talked about what it was, right? So then I kind of thought, well, let me just look at the Last Supper in Luke 22, right? So Luke 22, let's see. Let's just read this real quick. I thought maybe it'll give me a little hint as to what I need to be thinking about in terms of frequency or whatever. But it says, in Luke 22:14, when the hour was come, he sat down with the 12. And he said to them, with desire, I've desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So Passover was when they did, the Lord's Supper occurred on Passover, okay? In fact, earlier in the chapter, it says the time of Passover had come and they prepared for Passover, right? So they did this on Passover. And Jesus says, for I say to you, I will not eat any more thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. This is an interesting statement. I checked on this. And the next section talks about the wine. He says he took the cup, gave thanks, and said, take this, divide it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of that fruit of the vine again until the kingdom of God shall come. And you know what I did? I went to when he had resurrected and his time on earth, I studied in the different gospels what happened. He never ate or drank anything in his resurrected body, it sounds like, in fulfillment of what he says right here. Now, I did look at, after the road to Emmaus with the apostles, he did appear to them, and it says he went in and he broke bread and distributed it for them, and then they realized who he was and he vanished. It doesn't say he ate or drank anything in that account. So it's just interesting. Not that that's relevant to our topic, but I just thought it was very interesting. Verse 19, he took the bread, gave thanks, brake it, and said, this is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Likewise also the cup after supper, saying, the cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. So all of this happening on Passover is very interesting. It's very interesting. So this is what I thought when I read this. I was like, well, let's go to Passover. Let's look at the first Passover, what was instituted by God for Passover, and how does this relate? So that's where we're going next, and that's, of course, in Exodus chapter 12. Now, I just took out the bullet points from what Passover was and put it here so we can just examine them. Okay, so let's just do that. These are the bullet points of what came out of Exodus chapter 12. This is when the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt, right? And it says, by the way, it says the Lord passed over the houses of the Egyptian and Israel and smote the firstborn. It does not say an angel of the Lord. Okay, so a very interesting thing you need to be aware of. It doesn't seem to have, there's no spirit or angel of death that came down to do this. The text says it was Yahweh, it was the Lord. Interesting. But here's what happened. On the first month of the year, Nisan. Now this is close to the beginning of April for us. The 10th day of the month is when this occurred. He says to the Israelites, take a lamb. The lamb is for eating. Take a lamb without blemish, a male lamb. Now you got to think about, how does this relate to Christ? Because everything here relates to Christ. Every single thing about the Passover. It's the lamb. It's for eating. What did Christ do in the Passover Last Supper? He gave the bread to them and said, eat, this is my body. This is a male lamb. Of course, Jesus being male. Without blemish. Jesus was not blemished by sin in any way. And it's interesting, this statement in Exodus 12. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before. I hadn't seen it and thought about it until this time. You're supposed to take this lamb from either the sheep or from the goats. Now, what did sheep and goats represent in the New Testament? Sheep and goats was Israel and the Gentiles. Do you realize that? So this lamb could be taken from the sheep or their goats. It could be a young goat. Think about that. They were supposed to, so on the 10th day they would do this, and they would keep the lamb they picked until the 14th day of the month. And so in the evening of the 14th day of Nisan, they would kill the lamb before the whole assembly. That's interesting. They would kill their lamb before the whole congregation of the Jews, the assembly. So is this talking about the redemption of the entire assembly through the blood of the lamb? Sounds like it. Then they would take the blood and wipe it on their doorposts on the two sides and on the top. They would eat the flesh of the lamb that night in their homes, and they would roast it with fire. This is interesting. Keep all these things in your head, okay? It just struck me as profound when I read through this, studying this week. The bread they were supposed to eat with the lamb meat, the roasted lamb, the bread they were supposed to eat had to be unleavened. In all of the New Testament parables, when Christ talks about leaven, leaven is equivalent with sin. So they were supposed to be unleavened, meaning no sin. All the bread they ate was sinless, essentially, unleavened. Bitter herbs. It's bitter. Not raw or wet. The meat of the lamb could not be raw or wet, but it had to be roasted with the fire. Okay? And then anything that they didn't eat of the lamb, because the entrails and the head and everything said they were supposed to keep that on the lamb when they roasted it. All together, the whole thing was roasted. Anything they don't eat, they were supposed to burn with fire. Now, I don't know about you, but based on our studies together, you may recognize that Christ did descend into Hades, the realm of fire, when he died on the cross. He descended into Hades. So is this symbology of Christ's descent into Hades? Any piece of the body of the lamb that is not eaten is consumed in fire. Does this strike you as it did me? As I was really just amazed at how this did represent what Christ did in the first century. They say it said to eat the lamb with your loins girded, with the shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, in haste. This kind of speaks of preparation, being ready, because just as for the Israelites in Egypt, they would have to leave their homes quickly after the Egyptians were smited. In the same way, all the writers in the New Testament talked about being ready. You know not the hour in which your Savior will come, the Lord will come. All this other stuff. So being ready, being prepared is amazing. It is another parallel. And then, I don't know about this part. This to me is tough a little bit. But when it says, God says to them, I will smite the firstborn of Egypt, man and beast, and against the gods of Egypt I execute judgment. This to me, at least loosely relates to the nations, the nation principalities in the Old Testament, that at the time of Christ's coming would be smitten. They would be gathered into the valley of decision, and then God would wage war on them and judge them, the valley of judgment, the valley of decision. And so when he talks about in the original Passover, what is it, like 12 or 1500 years before Christ, he represents that by saying, I'm smiting Egypt, man and beast. I'm smiting the gods of Egypt. It's just amazing to me. And he says, quote, when I see the blood on your door, I will pass over you and not destroy you. Of course, through Christ's blood, we are not destroyed. We do not go to perdition. We do not have to see death in finality. We, in the end, will be taken safely to heaven. And then, in addition to this, they were supposed to eat that unleavened bread from the 14th day to the 21st day. That's 7 days of eating unleavened bread. 7 days of sinlessness. And that to me was a tough one to pin down. The number 7, of course, to me is significant of the scheduled history of the world. 7,000 years, 7 days, the 7 days of creation, the 6th in which man would be redeemed, and the 7th Sabbath. And so that all is relevant, but I don't know exactly how it all matches. And so, but the fact that it says eat unleavened bread from the 14th to the 21st day for 7 days, is this a picture of the fact that the blood of the Lamb wiped out sin for all creation, all 7 days, all 7,000 years of history, that all sin, all the bread was unleavened through the blood of the Lamb, that all sin was made null, essentially. That all we have to do is claim and lean on that gift, the blood of the Lamb. And I mean, it's powerful. I'm not 100%, perfect on all of this, but it is interesting. All these things make a lot of sense. And then the last thing I did put was that if anyone during that 7 days ate the unleavened bread, or the leavened bread, they were supposed to eat unleavened bread, but if they ate the leavened bread with sin, they were cut off from the congregation of Israel at that time. So anyone in this case, in that time, that ate the leavened bread during this 7-day period was cut off from Israel. And they were not allowed probably to go into the wilderness and then, into the promised land at the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So I hope you see all the correlation here between Christ and the Passover. There's so much that it's almost ridiculous to think it means anything else. And I hope that is at least profound and interesting for you. I'd say go to Exodus 6 and study this. Study Exodus. I said Exodus 6. I meant 12. Study Exodus 12 again and again, and you make your own decision on how does that relate to Christ, because it seems like it does in so many ways. Almost everything that is said about Passover seems to relate to Christ. And then, okay, so in the study of communion and Passover and Last Supper, to me, Christ's exercise of the Last Supper on Passover with the disciples, the apostles, is relevant. It's extremely important. Because what's happened at this time, he says in one of the Gospels, it says, this is my blood of the New Testament or covenant, the new agreement. So he's usurping the law of Passover and saying, I am the new Passover. I'm the Passover lamb. I came and I'm fulfilling it. And so now you're going to do this thing. It's not the way Passover was. You're doing this thing now, the bread, the wine, in remembrance. Because now I've come, I've done the thing. And so now this practice will be remembrance. It's almost like he's saying Passover is changing into the Lord's Supper. And so, I don't know, after studying Exodus 12 and then coming back to Luke 22, I was thinking, wow, the parallels are profound. And could Christ have really been saying Passover is the Lord's Supper now? It's different. So now we come to the idea and the discussion of Quartodecimanism. I don't know how many of you are even familiar with this. I was 100% unfamiliar with this last week when Cornelius, you brought this to my attention. The word Quartodecimanism, quarto meaning 4 and deci meaning 10, means the practice of celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan, okay? Which of course would correlate perfectly with Passover. Being on whatever day of the week, this is practicing Easter at the same time as Passover was to be kept, okay? And so the idea of Quartodecimanism came up because as time marched forward from the time of Christ, it sounds like there became kind of a division in the church, the apostolic and early Christian church, about whether they should celebrate the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, on this day, the 14th of Nisan, as was Passover celebrated by the Jews, or should they celebrate it on the Sunday closest to that time? Because they did, of course, their weekly meetings they did on Sundays, and they talked about that being the day of the Lord, so to speak. Although I don't fully grasp yet, Cornelius, where the day of the Lord practice came from. Other than, I've heard it said that they started practicing the day of the Lord meetings because Christ was said to have arisen on Sunday. So they started practicing on Sundays, their weekly meetings. But there was a controversy that arose in the early church, mostly towards the 3rd and 4th centuries, that Christians in the churches of Jerusalem and Asia Minor observed Easter on the 14th of the first month, Nisan. So in Palestine, Jerusalem, Asia Minor, all the areas that the apostles were in, those areas apparently were observing Easter on the 14th day of Nisan. And the correlation between Easter and the Last Supper to me is important, because it's all talking about the same thing that Christ did. And so, very interesting. But at this time, apparently, Jerusalem, Asia Minor, all the normal churches that were written to in the New Testament, they all practiced, apparently, they practiced the celebration of Easter, which I would assume included the Last Supper. They practiced that on the 14th day of Nisan, on the Passover, in place of Passover for the Jews, because they knew it was redone, remade by Christ. And it says, while at the same time, churches in and around Rome and the Alexandrian churches in Egypt, they practiced celebrating Easter on the Sunday following the first full moon of the vernal equinox. Well, the interesting thing about that, and of course they called it the day of the resurrection of the Savior, but that was, I believe, and I haven't studied Ishtar and Astarte and the worship of those pagan gods, but I believe that was the day that the pagans celebrated the coming of Astarte, the spring equinox, the start of the new year, essentially, but in a fertility way, like with the fertility goddesses. And so I believe, to me, that seems like it makes sense that was probably where some of the Christian churches in Rome followed suit with the pagan practices of the day. That's my guess. I want to study this a little further now. Thank you, Cornelius. You brought this to my attention and caused me to get into it a little deeper. I love this. This is great. But I guess, by what I have seen now, that the original practice was to practice Easter on the 14th of Nisan, which if you study the Jewish calendar, the calendar is based on the cycles of the moon. So this year, I believe that day is April 6th. I looked it up on a Jewish calendar. So this year, I believe April 6th is the 14th of Nisan. You may want to double check me on that, but I think I saw that. So it's not always, I don't even know if it's always in April because of the way the moon cycle goes. The moon cycle is like, I think, 28 or 30 days. So every full moon is a new month. Did you know that? Did you know that the original calendar as built by God with the stars and the moon was a lunar calendar? So the Jewish calendar is still based on that. So the new moon prior to the 14th of Nisan is the start of Nisan. And then 14 days into it should be, as far as I understand it, 14 days into that should be the 14th of Nisan, where Passover would be celebrated. Michael, you say that there's usually a full moon during Passover. Perhaps I'm mistaken in how that plays out, but I understood that the new moon was the start of every month, but I could be wrong. It was lunar cycle, but the other thing that I saw was that as time went on, Polycarp apparently practiced Easter, the celebration of Easter, and I would assume that means celebration of the Eucharist, on the 14th of Nisan, the Passover. So there was an argument, according to Eusebius, there was an argument between Polycarp and, a few of the different, church fathers. I don't know if I want to go into all this. There were some synods where they kind of, changed the overall Christian view from being on the 14th of Nisan to being completely on the Sunday, like the second Sunday or whatever. And so there was a time, and guess when the time was when this changed from being based on the 14th of Nisan to being squaring up with the Roman calendar and being on Sunday as Easter or Astartes Day. It was the Council of Nicaea in 325. Can you imagine that? Guys, I have said it before and I'll say it again. The Council of Nicaea, there's something pivotal about that moment in history, more so than people realize. It changed so much about the Christian church. When Constantine and the Catholic Church got involved in Christianity and started cauterizing the ideas, making doctrines, making bishops and pastors sign on to papers saying they believed certain things, some evil, horrible fall occurred in the church. I'm just going to say that's what I believe in my heart. It's something that you could probably study all your life to understand, but every time I come up against the Council of Nicaea, something horrible has happened because of it. I'm just saying. It's just, I don't know what to say about that, but it's terrible. Every time I study about the council and what came out of it and what happened in those years surrounding it, it's this kind of thing where the original practice of something that was correct and pure was changed into something either half pagan or to match pagan practices, or it's just amazing. John Chrysostom, which is interesting, I've read a lot of his writing. John Chrysostom apparently harassed different bishops about this topic and said that they shouldn't practice on the Passover anymore. And he actually, it says, the church historian Socrates of Constantinople knew of different Quartodecimans, people who believed in the Passover practice, that were deprived of their churches by John Chrysostom. He went and he kicked them out of their churches, essentially. It's amazing. It's amazing. So anyway, that's what I have on the communion, the Eucharist, and Quartodecimanism. Cornelius, I hope I at least addressed your topic well enough to where we all have more of an understanding. I hope that is good and helpful. I see some comments. I'm trying to figure if there's any comments here we need to talk more about, but we've spent a good amount of time, and I do want to get on to our other topics. Let's see here. What are y'all talking about? Let's put that on this. C. Jones, ironically, that's when the Bible was, quote, compiled, you say. That was the root of my question on one of your videos. How can we trust what they compiled for us? Well, they might have compiled the Bible, but they didn't rewrite all the writings. So to me, the writings are valid. They probably did take some stuff out that we should be reading, right? So I would say that much at least. Come Alive, you say you cannot believe the story behind Catholicism. Yeah, Catholicism was not our friend, I don't think. Lindsay Ball, you say the Catholic backstory is nonsense, in my opinion. Interesting. Squiffy Bear, I really like your statement. Believing that to know God we need a middleman is the subversion. I believe that's true. I hope that I make that point clear with what I do here on this channel. I don't think I'm ever doing anything you guys can't do. And in some cases, I'm just showing you the information. I hope that that is apparent with what I do. I do believe, like you're saying, that every person can do the same amount of study. There's nothing stopping you from doing anything I'm doing or anyone else is doing. So for any man to come to you and tell you you have to believe a certain way and that it's right and you're wrong, you should always reevaluate that. You should always decide whether you trust that person. You should always decide if you need to do that study yourself to find out if what they're saying is true. I would always encourage that. Even with myself, don't take my word for it. I used to like that about, what's his name? Chuck Missler. I used to listen to a lot of Chuck Missler teaching. Of course, now I disagree with a lot of Chuck Missler teaching, but I still appreciate the man. I still appreciate his work, his hard work to teach other people. And that's one of the things he always said, don't take my word for it. And so I echo that sentiment. Don't take my word for it. Study yourself if you really want to know, what you want to figure out what you believe. Interesting. Lindsay Ball, you say, look up 536 AD, the worst year ever, and then came the Dark Ages. Okay. It's interesting. I will consider that. I always put little notes here from things you guys tell me so that I can check up on things. So, yeah. Great. All right. Well, y'all think about going on to our next topic here. All right, let's see. This one, I think this one will get a few of you guys excited. I think I've heard about this one before from quite a few of you. The topic now is going to be the validity of Paul's epistles or his letters in the New Testament. So I hope this is one where it's going to be me showing you what I found more than me telling you what I think, because what I think is that I feel still, based on what I do know, that the validity of Paul's letters is pretty well established in most cases. I think there are some exceptions to that, but in most cases, most of his letters are pretty well established as reliable texts. At the very least, reliable texts and accepted texts by the Christian community in the early 1st and 2nd century. But then there's a couple that are questionable to me as well, but that beside the point. What we're going to do here now is talk more about where does this view of Paul's letters being spurious come from? Because that is, I think, the topic. That's the real topic. So let me get down to my notes here on this, and we will talk more about it. So, were Paul's letters authentic is kind of the question we're asking. And there's, lots of Wikipedia articles on this. Wikipedia is a source. It's not the best source, but on some things, it's a good clearinghouse for information. So, one of the things to think about is something like this, which is kind of where modern scholarship has rested. And the majority of modern scholarship has rested that there are some Pauline epistles that are not disputable, that are pretty much undisputed by almost all scholars. And that would be these listed here in this column on the first epistle of Thessalonians, the epistle of Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans. Almost all scholars in general throughout history have agreed that those are legitimate, okay? And then the next thing is, well, there's some disputed ones. So of the disputed ones, it kind of goes from the top here to most least disputed to most disputed. I think that might be true. But anyway, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians are called Deuteropauline epistles. A lot of scholars think that there's a possibility they're authentic, possibility they're not. I do question 2 Thessalonians quite a bit. Oops, oh, come on now. Hold on. Okay. I question 2 Thessalonians a bit myself. Then you get to the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Again, I think we had some of this conversation last week, but I agree that the Timothys are possibly not from Paul, but I don't know for sure. I haven't, again, studied it super carefully and super in depth, but anyway. And then Hebrews by many is said, here's what the scholars say about Hebrews. They're like, it sounds like Paul. If you just examine the wording, the way it's written, it seems Pauline, but they don't know for sure because for one, the book doesn't claim an authorship. It doesn't say in the beginning, this is Paul, blah, blah, blah. So again, this is one that people question. They question it. Michael, you say Hebrews could be Barnabas. There is a lot of that discussion that happens too. So I hope that shows you, at least that's kind of just a picture of where modern scholarship is. And in general, consensus-wise, this is how it's viewed. This chart is a good example of how it's viewed. Now, that being said, as I started digging into this, how can I get this? I want this to be more readable for you guys. Definitely want it to be more readable. So let's change this to that. All right. So I start digging in, right? Wikipedia has a nice page on the authorship of the Pauline epistles, completely about that topic. So I started looking into this. It seems that in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, you had this school of thought out of Germany and the Netherlands. And this is where higher criticism was born. Higher criticism is when the scholarship around the New Testament and the Bible starts to kind of tear at traditional understandings, and instead of taking accepted understanding of traditional authorship of text understandings and when things were written and all this, they started instead ignoring all of the tradition and looking at the text itself and in a very critical fashion tearing apart, what does it say, how does it say it, how does that relate to the time period in which we think it occurred? And they started really tearing into it from a comparative aspect, kind of comparing texts to themselves and to each other, texts of the time period, to try to, I don't want to say verify the traditional understandings, but in fact come up with new understandings based on what they felt was a better way to analyze the scriptures. Okay, maybe that's a good way to say it. That being said, I don't fully agree with the higher critics on the way they approached things. I think they should have taken the traditional understandings and the testimonies of other writings and things like that into consideration as well. I think higher criticism is, I have doubts about higher criticism. I think that in one way, the idea of it is possibly helpful to the discussion of authorship, dating on ancient texts. But in one way, I think by throwing out previous scholarship, I think they kind of chop their legs off despite their, intent. They kind of crippled their study of the writings as well. So you have this University of Tübingen, and so there were the Tübingen critics, and that was, I believe that was the German school of higher criticism. And then there's the Dutch scholars, the Dutch school of criticism, which was called the radicals, the Dutch radical higher critics. And so the 19th century, a group of scholars at the University of Tübingen, led by Ferdinand Bauer, engaged in a radical Bible study, including the claim that only Romans 1 and 2, only Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians were authored by Paul, and no other books were authored by Paul. During the same period, another group of Dutch scholars, led by Pearson, the radical school of the Dutch, argued that all Pauline epistles were pseudepigraphal. None of them were written by Paul. And it's interesting, this was Lohmann and Manin and Steck who were part of this school, and they said that none of the epistles were written by Paul. So I just wanted you guys to first see, where does this thought come from? It comes from these guys. 1800 years after Christ, and after these writings were written, they come along and say, well, they're not what everyone thought they were for the last 1800 years. Okay, so that's suspect in and of itself. Okay, we've talked about that before. How anyone in the modern time that comes up with something that's so different from almost all of recorded history is problematic and should be highly suspect to all of us, right? But they did argue this. Out of this higher critic school came this thing. By the way, as I had said, both these positions of these schools, the German school and the Dutch school, have been abandoned by mainstream scholarship now. They have been, because, like I said, that chart at the beginning, that's kind of the consensus view. And the position of these higher critics, and these were extreme higher critics. There were other higher critics, students of higher criticism, that did not go to the extremes that these groups did. But these groups went to this extreme level and started denying the scholarship, the authorship of the Pauline epistles in the New Testament. And this is where it came from. If you want to read more about the people, read about Abraham Dirk Lohmann or Willem Christian van Manen. These were the two that pushed most of these views. For instance, Van Manen's 1865 doctoral thesis, now this was interesting. It concluded that the First Thessalonians authorship was genuine by Paul of Tarsus. But then he waffled and vacillated, and in 1889 he wrote a review where he agreed with Steck that it was a pseudepigraphal work. So even Van Manen, in his doctoral thesis, he agreed that First Thessalonians was written by Paul. Later on, he got with these other guys, Steck and Lohmann, and decided they were pseudepigraphal. So you can see even within their group, there was some conversation that occurred, some perhaps vacillation. I don't know. His first volume treated Acts and the theory of the development of Christianity. He argued that Acts was dependent on Flavius Josephus' writings and other works, and assigned it to the second quarter of the 2nd century, which is interesting. So the book of Acts, that to me is a silly notion, but he said that the book of Acts was dependent on Josephus' work, which Josephus wrote his stuff in the late 1st century. And so if Acts was dependent on that, it would put it in the 2nd century, which is what he did, which I would say that's kind of patently ridiculous. The work of the book of Acts is very well couched based on the events of Acts in the 1st century. I don't know. That would take a lot of research for me to knock that wall down. I don't really want to do that research. I'm not really that interested in it, but there you go. That's what he said at one point. And then this radical critical group from the Dutch, there was this article I found. The radical group of Dutch, they denied the authorship of all the Pauline epistles, all of them. And this article I found from 1902 says that the radical scholars did not want to be impeded by church canons and wanted to be free in their research of the New Testament and the history of early Christianity. This research led them to the conclusion we do not have any authentic Pauline epistles. So this is what I was talking about. They kind of just threw out all scholarship, all traditional scholarship, and started over with their higher critical point of view of, we're going to examine the text itself and come to our own conclusions and just ignore everything that came before us, including the church canons, which the church canons should be seen as evidence of the authority of these writings. There's no sense in which that should not be the case. So I don't agree with that viewpoint at all. And I mean, the viewpoint of that they should throw out the church canons and some of the older scholarship in lieu of their new way of attacking these writings. So to me, that's problematic. I can't, again, verify any of or all or none of their claims on the Pauline epistles. I haven't done enough study to know that. But what I'm showing you is where these ideas came from. So here's my statement on this. If you have an opinion that the Pauline epistles, that any of the writings of Paul were not authentic, and you don't know the names of these guys and what they believed, then you have no right to argue that the Pauline epistles are not authentic. Do you see what I'm saying? These guys is where all those thoughts came from. So if you think that the Pauline letters are not authentic and you don't know what we're talking about, you don't know about Lohmann and Manon and Steck, and the radical school of the Dutch, and you don't know about the Tübingen school, then you don't know enough to have an opinion, really. And you don't know the foundation of your own viewpoint. So if you are curious about the authenticity of the Pauline epistles and you don't know this stuff, you need to go and you need to learn this stuff, because this is where that came from. Okay. And so I just wanted to say that this is as far as I got this week. This is as far as I got. I did learn a lot. I learned a lot about where this came from. And I found this website. I think this is, so just note this on your screen. You may have to pause it and come back to this. Maybe I'll put it in the description. To me, this was a very interesting link. This is a writing by Van Manen, one of the Dutch school. Was he the Dutch school or the Tübingen school? This is one of those guys we just looked at. And this is about his views on the Pauline epistles. But you can see this is, I mean, if this was in book form, this would be like 50 pages of reading. So if you think that the Pauline epistles are not legitimate, then you need to come and read this document. You need to read all of this to understand what you think, your points here. So this to me, I got into a little of this and I was like, I don't have the time for this. So I didn't read all this. It gets very technical, guys, very super technical. And it just, to me personally, that's all I've got on my material. So I'm going to hide that information, but feel free to study that. For me personally, this is not important enough of a conversation or a topic for me to study and spend the time on. It's not as important as I think some people make it. If some of the works that are considered Paul's writings are pseudepigraphal and not actually Paul, what does it matter? To me, it's more important whether they were authoritative in the early church that matters to me. And I have done that research, and so I know which books of Paul's are authoritative and which are not. For instance, I believe 2 Timothy is quite questionable. 2 Thessalonians is questionable. Even 1 Thessalonians feels a little sketchy. So I know enough about that to have my spider sense about me, my spidey sense, and know what I'm reading, know when the time period was of it. But for me, this discussion of whether they were Paul's writings or not is not that important. It's not that important to me. So for me personally, that's where I stand. I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time, for instance, trying to read this whole document and many others like it that are they're so down in the weeds of, oh, well, this was mentioned in this writing, and it was also sort of mentioned over here, and this seems to be like this over here. And I don't have time for that, guys. I don't have time for that. This is a lot. This is a lot. Oh my gosh. These guys, this was they were like the Stoic philosophers. They were just so wound up in their minds on trying to find some nugget of something in these writings. I don't get it. I don't get the whole notion. I just don't. But that's just me. Maybe it's maybe I'm just not the guy that is the one who will find out whether these guys were right or not. Maybe it's just not in me to do that. I see Russell Davis, you like this topic. You've studied a lot. You could have done this segment a lot better than me. I mean, I don't know, but maybe Russell, this document I showed you is one you want to study. Maybe you already know of it. I don't know, but again, I would challenge you though, if this is, your wheelhouse, you better know all these things I just talked about, because that was like, just scratching the surface on where those ideas came from. And of course, all of it out of the 19th century. To me, again, that's suspect to begin with. But then, if this is your argument, or, you take these, you better know this stuff, because this stuff is complicated. So anyway, Squiffy Bear, these things always seem to end up as a battle of intellect. Yeah, that's what I sometimes feel like. I sometimes, when I see a battle of intellect going on, so for instance, it makes me think of Facebook, because I used to be on Facebook a little bit. I would go into different, chats and talk with people about, for instance, preterism and stuff. When it becomes a battle of, I know more of this stuff than you do, it's not valuable for anybody. So I'm with you there, Squiffy Bear, on that. It's, if it becomes a battle of, I know more than you about this thing, and it's so complicated nobody can really argue with each other, then it's not valuable to anybody either. So Lindsay Ball, you say you don't need intellect, just faith in the Lord to preserve his word. Yeah, maybe. People are all twisted up about it. Northbound Believer, you say, whenever someone refers to Jesus as Yeshua, it's a dead giveaway. They are not in full possession of the facts. Interesting. Come Alive, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Christ is Lord of the Sabbath. All right. So let's see. What's our next topic? I think there's one more I want to do. We've gone a long time, but I'm trying to see, is this last one something I can do? Oh, shoot. Guys, I don't know. I don't know if I can do Melchizedek. Melchizedek's a long one. How about we do Great Commission, the Great Commission? Mama chose joy. I think we can do yours before the end here. I don't think King Melchizedek will take 30 or 40 minutes. So I don't want to do that one. Let's quickly see if we can talk about the Great Commission and perhaps Romans chapter 1. So let me do that. Get the screen up for you guys. There we go. Okay. Whoa. All right. Okay. So Romans. Well, first let's go to the Great Commission real quick. We'll read that. Matthew 28. Scroll all the way down. Oops, not that far. Then the 11 disciples went away to Galilee, into a mountain where Jesus had appointed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and spake to them, saying, all power is given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore, teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Okay, so that would be the Great Commission that I'm familiar with. There may be more if we went to the other Gospels, just little variances, but I think that's it. So then let's go to Romans 1. Okay, so Romans 1. Greetings to the saints in Rome. I thank God through Christ Jesus for you, etc., etc. Okay, after his introduction, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, the power of God to salvation, everyone that believes, the Jew first, and also the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And this is interesting. So, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to them. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Who is he talking about? See, this is interesting. I want you to think about this, because I started to understand when I read this passage not too many years ago. Professing themselves wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, four-footed beasts, birds, creeping things. Interesting. When did the corruption of the image of God occur? It occurred in the Garden of Eden. Man, who was made in the image of God, became corruptible, like birds, four-footed beasts, and creeping things. This time period that Paul is talking about in Romans 1, assuming Paul wrote it, right? The wrath of God was revealed against all mankind. When? Well, that would be in Noah's flood. And they professed themselves wise, but they were vain in their imaginations. Their hearts were darkened. They became fools. They changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. And God, what? He gave them up to their uncleanness through the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies between themselves. Wow, sounds like Sodom. Who changed the truth of God into a lie and worship to serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. To me, I understood this all as being talked about in the context of history. And so when I saw all of this and reread it for about the 100th time, right, I think the Lord opened my eyes to realize that he was talking about what happened with the patriarchs in the Old Testament and the history of the world where mankind had corrupted itself, essentially exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature. God gave them up to vile affections. Of course he did. And then he cleansed the earth with the flood. Men left their natural use of the woman and burned towards one another. They did not retain God in their knowledge. God gave them over to a reprobate mind, wickedness, fornication, covetousness, all these things. Who, knowing not the judgment of God, well, they didn't know the judgment of God because at that time God hadn't judged the world. They committed such things worthy of death, and not only do the same, but have pleasure in those that do. And then Christ judged them all in the flood. So it comes now to present time, you are inexcusable, O man. Whatsoever thou art that judge, for wherein you judge another, you condemn yourself, etc., etc. So that's my understanding of Romans 1. I'm now trying to understand, Mama Chose Joy, in what way do you feel like it relates to the Great Commission? That the Great Commission was fulfilled in Romans 1. Is that, I think, what you said? If you're still on, I'd like to know. Oh, you're talking about verse 8. Is that what you're talking about? I see in the comments you say verse 8. Yeah, right there at the top of my screen. I was wondering specifically about verse 8. Let me go back to that and let's look at it specifically. Yeah, because verse 8's before all the talk about the what I believe is the patriarchs and the history of mankind. Verse 8 being first, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all that your faith is spoken of through the whole world. Ah, okay. Yeah, okay. So now I'm back on track, right? This as the Great Commission, I do believe that it's related to the Great Commission. I do believe that. Then also, I want to go somewhere else too. Bible. Let's go here. Okay. I'm looking for something specific. All right. So Romans actually has this theme in it a few times of the word, the gospel having gone out to all the nations. So, yeah. Oh, I'm looking for some specific wording that I think is key to this understanding. I'm coming up short, but I think I'm looking for the passage. There's a passage in Romans further on from verse or chapter 1 that says that now the word has gone out to all nations. It essentially says it. Of course, it talks about Abraham being the father of many nations. That's not exactly what I was looking for. Oh, here it is. This is the verse I was thinking of. Romans 6, let me put it on the screen. Romans 6, 20, or 16, 26. Romans 16, 26. But now is made manifest, meaning Christ, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. All right, so to God only wise be glory through Jesus Christ forever. So this is saying that it has gone out to all nations. Of course, in Acts chapter 1 and 2, it says that all nations were gathered in Jerusalem at the time. And then what happened? Pentecost occurred, and this, what we would say, magical outpouring of the Holy Spirit caused them to be able to speak the gospel to all nations at the same time. Does that not sound kind of amazing? Does it not sound like God fulfilling his own prophecy? I believe that's what that is. And yes, I still feel like I'm not finding the exact verse I'm looking for, but Romans has that theme in it multiple times, that the word had now gone out to all nations. And so to expect, as many do, that in some time in the future that the gospel will finally be preached to every people group on earth, and then Jesus Christ can come, it's a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding of all these things that we know did occur. And according to the scriptures themselves, as you're reading, they did occur. And the gospel did go out to all nations at that time. And that was part of what the Christians were supposed to be doing, is teaching that, is spreading it, And so, yeah, that to me is the same thing, Mama Chose Joy, that the Great Commission was talking about. And that's part of the reason, the Great Commission is part of the reason why at Pentecost, all the nations, all the different people from all nations were in Jerusalem at that time. So yes, I do think that's all related and part of the Great Commission and part of that spreading of the gospel that God did, through his church, but in many ways very miraculously to all nations at that time, before the kingdom, before Christ came back in the clouds in 70 AD. That is what makes the most sense with all these texts, including Romans, like you're talking about. So I think you hit the nail on the head, really. And as you read more through Romans, and if I found the verse that I was actually thinking of, I think it would have been more apparent. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with finding that verse, but yeah, Romans does make that assertion, and I think it's a few different places, and it may also be in Revelation, the beginning chapters of Revelation, that the gospel had spread to all nations. So I hope that answers your question. I didn't take a lot of time there, but I think that puts us all on the right track for that, understanding more about that. But yeah, I think it was all part of what happened then. I mean, that doesn't mean we shouldn't go out and spread the gospel now, but the Great Commission was given to those people, his disciples, right before he ascended, so that they would do what was required for the next 40 years during the time of waiting before the kingdom came in. So yeah, that all makes sense. It makes sense that we find evidence that it was fulfilled. So yeah. Well, guys, I think that's about it today. We've gone a good amount of time. We've gotten a lot in. I'm tired, so that means we did something good. So I hope that you guys have gotten a lot out of this session, and I just appreciate all of you being here. Again, your dedication to sticking with me and getting the value out of this. I think that's important. I think that's special and something that I don't see many places. So I'm glad we can do this together. And I thank God for each and every one of you. And I will try to pray for you this week. And y'all have a good one. Stay safe. There's a lot of weird things going on this week. No one knows what's going on. But I do hope you all stay safe. God bless. Take care.